Okay, so this is section 1 of chapter 3, titled Constructs and Operational Definitions. So recall, in step 1 of the research process, the goal was to find some topic or question that can serve as the basis of your study. Step 2 was to derive a hypothesis from this topic. And now that you have your hypothesis, you need to define the variables that will be involved in your study, and that will be the topic of this section. So recall, a variable is a characteristic or condition that will have different values for different individuals. Now, some variables are pretty straightforward and easy to measure and define. For example, blood pressure, height, weight, income, the amount that somebody tips. These are all, again, pretty straightforward variables, and there's not going to be a lot of debate about what they mean or how they should be measured. However, in psychology, you may encounter more complicated variables like self-esteem or confidence or motivation. And these pose a greater challenge because they can't be observed or measured directly. So they have to be measured indirectly. Okay, so with those challenges in mind, let's talk about theories and constructs. So science makes progress through the advancement of theories. A theory, in psychology, refers to a set of statements about the mechanisms underlying a particular behavior. Now, theories are important because they are used to organize and to explain the results of psychological studies. Furthermore, theories should also be able to generate predictions. So for example, if you have a theory that states that low self-esteem interferes with academic performance, then you should be able to make predictions regarding the grades of children with a low self-esteem. Now, these theories will often contain hypothetical mechanisms and various intangible elements. And if a theory successfully explains a large body of data and makes accurate predictions, then we assume that those intangible elements are real. Now, this happens in many other fields as well. For example, in physics, you might assume the existence of certain types of particles or forces if making those assumptions helps your theory explain more data or make more accurate predictions. So just like a physicist might posit the existence of certain physical forces by observing nature, a psychologist might posit the existence of certain psychological forces. And although we may not be able to see these forces directly, if such forces exist, we should be able to detect their influence on human behavior. So for example, many psychological theories posit the existence of psychological forces such as motivation or self-esteem. And although we can't directly observe motivation or self-esteem, we can describe these forces by observing their effects on behavior. For example, academic performance or criminality. So in this example, motivation and self-esteem are referred to as constructs or hypothetical constructs. So again, constructs are defined as hypothetical attributes or mechanisms that help explain or predict behavior. Okay, so here's a simple model that we can use to understand this process and the role of constructs. So, get my So let's say there's some environmental stimulus that you experience, and this stimulus affects a construct. Then the construct affects some behavior, and this is where your measurement is going to occur. For example, let's say you have an exam coming up. Okay, the exam is the external stimulus. The exam affects a psychological construct. For example, anxiety, and your anxiety levels go up. And the anxiety, the construct, affects some external behavior. For example, lack of focus, or maybe physiology, such as heart rate or blood pressure. All right, so as we've been discussing, constructs cannot be measured directly, but we can observe and measure the external factors and behaviors that are associated with the construct. And this is a way of measuring the construct indirectly. So typically what happens is psychologists will identify various behaviors that are thought to be related to the construct. Then those behaviors are measured in place of the construct as an indirect measure of the construct. So each construct that you hope to measure in your study will require an operational definition. So operationalizing a construct means defining it in such a way where a measurement can be collected. So if you want to study something like happiness, let's say you have a hypothesis that spending time in nature makes people happier. Okay, that's fine. But now you have to pause and think about how you're going to measure happiness. You can't measure it directly. There's no magical happiness meter. So you have to think about how being happy affects the behavior or maybe the physiology of a person. What would be different between a happy person and a sad person? So maybe you measure how often somebody smiles or laughs when they're outside versus inside. Maybe you measure stress levels and cortisol in the blood under the assumption that happier people will be less stressed. Okay, other examples. Intelligence can be operationalized as performance on an IQ test. Or, for example, let's say you're measuring hunger. Maybe you want to know whether hunger makes rats more aggressive. So in that case, you might define hunger, you might operationalize hunger as the number of hours that have elapsed since the animal has eaten. And maybe you define aggression as the number of times a rat bites another rat. So again, these are examples of operational definitions where you take some psychological construct that can't be observed or measured directly and define it in such a way that allows you to collect a measurement which serves as a proxy for the construct of interest. So operationalism is a really important concept that forces you to think much more deeply about whatever idea you're interested in. You know, we all have these words that we use all the time, like happy, depressed, anxious, self-esteem, motivation, often without thinking very deeply about exactly what it is that we mean by these terms. But with operational definitions, you are forced to confront such concepts at a much deeper level and ask, how does motivation or self-esteem or optimism actually exert effects on tangible reality. So in the same way that we can measure the effects of gravity on the behavior of physical objects, we should be able to measure the effects of psychological constructs on human behavior or physiology. And so you have to define these constructs in a way that allow for some measurement to be carried out. Now, although operational definitions are crucial for science, especially psychology, they do have some limitations that we should discuss. In some ways, their strength is also their weakness. They allow you to measure a construct indirectly, which is great. But the indirectness is also weakness. And it's important to understand that the operational definition, the thing actually being measured, is not identical to the construct that you care about. So if you read a study that says, I don't know, people who ate donuts were happier than people who ate broccoli. I don't know if such hard-hitting studies have been done, but if that were the case, you have to understand that the scientists didn't measure happiness directly in its pure essence, but rather they measured some proxy, some outward manifestation of happiness. Maybe how often people smiled, or how often they closed their eyes and moaned as they were eating. I don't know. And maybe these are good measures for happiness, and maybe they're not. So when evaluating a study, you're always justified in asking, how well does the dependent variable, the thing actually being measured, capture the construct that the scientist actually cares about? Because, the number of times that somebody smiles is probably not that interesting in and of itself. Rather, it is only interesting to the extent that it reveals something about the psychological state of the person. So it's possible that many operationalized variables that are measured by psychologists are rather weak approximations for the actual constructs that the psychologists care about. And the operational definitions may leave out important aspects of a construct. So for example, if a construct like happiness is multidimensional, if it has multiple components, how many of those dimensions are being captured by smile frequency or smile duration? Probably not many. Or consider the opposite problem. Operational definitions may include other components that are not part of the construct. So maybe you think you're measuring one construct, but in fact you're measuring multiple constructs and their interactions. And so there's almost never a one-to-one correspondence between the operational definition, the thing you measure, and the construct that you actually care about. Okay, so here's another example. Take college exams, right? The bane of your existence. When you take a college course, your grade should be some reflection of how much knowledge you've acquired. The problem is, us professors, we can't measure knowledge directly. There's no way to measure it directly. So we have to give you some project or some examination, and the idea is that your performance on the exam is some approximation of the knowledge that you have acquired. And sometimes it is, but maybe sometimes it isn't. So, for example, if a student does very poorly on an exam, it could be because they just didn't study and never read the material. and acquired zero knowledge. Or it could be because they are sick or sleep deprived or are dealing with high levels of anxiety or depression. So in those situations, a student might do very poorly on an exam, but in those cases, their grade, their score, is not a good reflection of their actual knowledge. So this is a problem for operational definitions. So in scientific studies, one thing you can try to do, is to include multiple procedures for measuring the same construct and hope that they all sort of converge. Okay, so using operational definitions, in practice, you probably don't need to create your own operational definitions, and you probably shouldn't unless you really know what you're doing and unless there's some need to create a new operational definition. So don't be a maverick. Rather, you should consult the scientific literature and figure out what approaches are commonplace and accepted for the measurement of different constructs that you care about for your study. So it's not that you can't come up with your own operational definitions, but the problem is that, one, it will be harder to compare your findings to other findings in the field, and two, you may have to put considerable effort into defending your operational definition and convincing other scientists and peer reviewers that your definition, your measurement is appropriate. So again, the advantages of using agreed upon operational definitions is that you can more easily compare your results to other studies, and that the well-established methods for measuring constructs have been vetted and have been shown to be appropriate for capturing those constructs. And now we will turn to the process of vetting an operational definition in the next section.